Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming out on a rather dark December evening. It's nice to see a decent turnout. We always worry about things quite running close to Christmas, whether there are other things that people might be doing. So thank you very much for coming out tonight. I'm sure you will not be disappointed. I think a lot of you will have seen some of this on Digging for Britain and or read about it in current archaeology, but it's always better to hear, well, I was going to say from the horse's mouth, but in fact the horses are not going to say anything tonight. But luckily we do have Paula Ware here, who is going to tell us all about the Pocklington chariot burials. A tale of three chariots. So over to you, Paula.
Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me? I'm going to take you into the Iron Age this evening and discuss three very unusual burials that we had. And if I just said to you, all three were totally unexpected. I'd started work in the 1980s just outside Malton for a company called the East Riding Archaeological Research Trust. And it was a legacy of a man from Yorkshire called Tony Brewster. And he had found chariot burials up on the Wolds. And my colleague and myself, Mark, said that was our lifetime ambition, was to find a chariot burial. But as the years went by and we got into our 30th year of working together, we didn't really think it was going to happen. So the three sites that I'm going to talk to you tonight are Burnby Lane at Pocklington, the Mile at Pocklington, and Site X. Now, I'm still on Site X because the developer didn't really want people to know about the site. But since most people know, it's a site at Melton on the Humber, and its importance in terms of Iron Age studies is quite remarkable. We are pushing for analysis and publication on this site. The other two sites have been published, and it would be really interesting to collate all this information together because the significance of the three sites really offers an insight into the Iron Age and the movement of people within this landscape. It's the East Riding of Yorkshire. Ian Stead from the British Museum had excavated at Wetwang, Kirkham, Burton Fleming. He has had chariot burials, but in particular, Ian mentioned circular barrows, but really with no great detail. And hopefully I'm going to expand a little bit more on these circular barrows that are part of the wider burial landscape. So the first site is Burnby Lane, Pocklington. I will give you some of the planning history. We were invited to do a desk-based assessment to assess this area of land here. It had been allocated for housing. As you can see, it was surrounded by crop marks from aerial photography that was undertaken by Derek Riley in 1979, and also to the south an extensive archaeological landscape, but nothing on our site. No work had been undertaken on this housing estate that went in the 1980s, but we suggested in the desk-based assessment that the site was of high archaeological potential. Little did we know how high it was going to be. So this Pocklington, just to give you the setting, in the East Riding, small market town which is expanding rapidly at the minute. I think about 3,000 houses have been built in the last few years around the edges of the town. Every site has had significant archaeological deposits, but this was the first site. As you can see, it's a pasture field with a little bungalow, and that's the outline of the development. And I think originally the application was for about 67 houses, but it was expanded into two phases, and in the end about 150 houses were built and people are living in them now. At that time, planning condition was granted without any trial trenching. That was what was the work pattern in the East Riding at that time. Hindsight would have been a great thing. Given planning permission, we then were commissioned to do geophysical survey. We employed West Yorkshire Archaeological Service to undertake the geophysics. This is not a criticism of the geophysics. It is a warning in terms of the geology. Geophysics is not an ideal indicator of how much archaeology is on a site. Yep, it indicated that we had a possible henge monument here. We had one square barrow, an enclosure and a trackway. It was then decided during the planning that the planning condition would have an area of strip map and record, this central area, and a watching brief here and a watching brief here. Now the bungalow had been removed, and what we actually had as we progressed on site, 87 barrows, 3 of which were Bronze Age, and 84 Iron Age square or circular barrows. As you can imagine, the developer wasn't exactly over the moon, but we worked together with them. We decided that we could clear the archaeology for them in advance of their work programme. What we asked for was they kept us updated in terms of a programme so we could hand over the areas that they needed. And to all intents and purposes, it did work, and it was a successful outcome, but it could have been horrendous, and it's not the ideal situation. So I am more than happy to press developers and say, really, you need to examine your risks. Mention the word risks to them, and they seem to key in with that. Because this soon circulated within developers that they hadn't managed the risk. There was no money in terms of their comfort zone of what they paid for the land. But it was a partnership that we decided to make the best job that we could do. There was no way that it wasn't going to be developed. So with the developers, academics and the field archaeologists, I think we came to a successful conclusion. But it could have been very difficult. So overview of the cemetery. We had 172 burials. We were on site for approximately a year, moving forward. At one point, there were 40 archaeologists working, but in the main, it was down to a key body of about 15. We worked very successfully with academics. The BBC came along and recorded, but I will give you more information about that. And we also had 40 Anglian burials. Now, the Anglian burials have not been looked at yet because of the other site as well in Pocklington, but that's for a future programme of works. And the earliest barrows on site were the Group 1 barrows. These are large barrows, over 11 metres in diameter. Very few had a central grave. You can see a couple here. This one had a central grave, and this one. The rest were flat, flat barrows with no central grave. Whether or not the inhumations were laid on the surface, that's why we haven't got the evidence, or they've been truncated by ploughing, we can't tell you. But these are the earliest barrows in the sequence. And there's a fantastic photo in the snow because it defines the barrow ditch really clearly. And you can see these Group 2 barrows, and there's flat burials around about. And you can see the contractor working quite close to us. And that's all the boundary there was between us. And then Group 2 barrows, 48 barrows in this group. They are smaller in dimensions, and they're slotted in and around the Group 1 barrows. These are about 6 to 9 metres in diameter. But we have one very strange one here. This very odd shape. And at the point, my colleague Mark said that he was absolutely certain it was an Anglian burial. And Yvonne Innell, who was the specialist in spears, came out to site, and she said, well, That's an Iron Age spear in there, and there was an Iron Age pot. We only had 2 pots on site, one in this barrow and one to the north up here. But both the spear and the pot were Iron Age, but Mark was adamant that the actual barrow itself and the burial in it was Anglian. As it turned out, he was correct. When the C14 days came, we had an Anglian burial within that barrow that had obviously been adapted. Now, Yvonne's reasoning is she thinks it's a reuse of a barrow. So the Iron Age spear and the pot that was in there were from an earlier burial, but there was no evidence for that at all. And there's a photo of a Group 2 grave. You can see that it's a deep grave, about 0.6. We had every single position that you can imagine for burials, but in the main, it was the classic facing east, north-south orientated crouched burial. Only 20% of the burials had grave goods, which coincided exactly with Stead's representation of the higher Wolds cemeteries. And then we have the Group 3 barrows. And as I mentioned, it's these circular barrows up here that I have a particular interest in. And at the time, they seem to stand out. So these are the latest barrows in the sequence. So we have the circular ones, and we have square ones that are fitted in within the Group 1s and Group 2s. And these circular barrows up in the north also seem to have secondary burials very close by. And that all sorts of thought processes. Why were these circular barrows being placed within the square barrow cemetery? What was separating them out? And more of this. So there you go. You can see the group assignment. Group 1, a reasonably large group. Group 2 is the largest, and then these Group 3, and we only had very few unassigned. The condition of the bone was not excellent. On the sands and gravels, the bone had deteriorated quite badly, but the information that we have got out from the burials is fascinating. So this is the distribution of grave goods, armlets, bone objects, and just the 2 pots, as I pointed out, pot in that Anglian burial, and a pot up here. And this burial is a lady, 46 plus. She was down here in the cemetery, and you can see her bangles on both wrists and this brooch that was up by her shoulder. And that's the bangle with the coral. After conservation, everything was lifted and went straight to conservation. The conservation work was undertaken by York Archaeological Trust, and Mags Felter, who worked for York at that stage, she worked on all 3 chariots with us. So it was great to have that continuity. And then you get the distribution of brooches, bow brooches and penannular brooches. Sophie Adams from the British Museum, she undertook the work on the brooches and has been able to identify different elements. This is the penannular brooch. And this is that lady in Barrow 2. This is her brooch before it's lifted. And this is the H-shaped brooch. The majority of these brooches that we found on site were familiar from other Yorkshire cemeteries. However, there were individual brooches that hadn't been found from a stratified deposit. A lot of them have been metal detectorists finds, but this is a complete brooch from a stratified deposit, and it has been so useful in terms of the C14 dating to be able to give a really tight chronology for brooches from the Iron Age. And you can see here this beautiful brooch with the coral you could wear it now. It looks absolutely fantastic. We're hoping that further research will be undertaken on the coral and where it was located. Did it come from the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, or possibly the North Sea? So it would be really useful to have further research undertaken. And it also had textile fragments. Now, I was pulled up on this, and I will explain, it isn't actually textile, it's the imprint of textile on the corrosive products of the brooch. And this is another one of the beautiful brooches, once again with the coral. And this is a Hull and Hawks Type 6, and it's normally found in hill forts in southern England. So really interesting in terms of people movement and possible trade. And this is a Hull and Hawks Type 2 CB. Once again, C14 dated, really accurate in terms of placing this in, the brooches within the chronology. Great, generally 250 BC, but you can see this the bulbous glass bead here. Right, this is where it starts to get difficult, because everybody that had been talking about brooches at this stage, and I'm talking about 3 or 4 years ago, looked at the zoomorphic designs, which was quite a standard thing for Iron Age. However, I gave a talk a few months ago, and somebody within the audience said, I've just done a PhD and I've dismissed that. So what I'm going to say is I'm just going to stick with the zoomorphic designs, if that's okay, because I quite like them, and I'll probably have to read the PhD before I change my mind. So just to put you in the picture there. But if you look here, I can definitely see a horse's head. Now, you may think, she's definitely going mad there. But it to me, horse's head, but it's a mixture of duck and goose, and that zoomorphic pattern that comes through these fantastic personal ornaments. You see it continuing through the Iron Age, how they looked at things from nature and interpreted into their personal goods. I just think it's wonderful. So I'm sticking with that at the minute. And then we had structural elements. Once again, talking about structural elements, we just had a discussion and a box was mentioned. When we were excavating, somebody said, well, is it a coffin? Well, I'm not sure if you could describe it as a coffin, but it is definitely a structural element, and this is what I propose. I have a feeling that it was part of that ritual of death, that it was open to members of the community to be able to view the body. So I'll just show you. This is the box here. You can see the outline of it. That's the grave cut itself. And this one has been placed on organic material within some kind of box. And this is the one that really shows. This is the grave cut that you can see quite clearly. And then this is the box with the body within it. And it's very ephemeral. You can see the strut. And I should point out that the timbers are not Iron Age. They're ours for aiding excavation. And we had nothing like that. They were just very ephemeral soil images of the box. And you can just see the skull coming up there. So, weapons and chariots. We didn't think we were going to get a chariot, but literally in the last few weeks of excavation, just typical. And if I just point out this triangle down here, I'll be coming back to that in a few minutes. I just want to talk to you about some of the weapons. So these are the circular barrows that I've taken a particular interest in here. And that's a really good AP just to show you the density, but how they stand out as well under excavation. And barrow 34 was a male aged 17 to 25. He was 70 to 80% of his skeleton complete. He was in a box within a circular barrow. He had grave goods of sword, scabbard, remnants, 5 spears, And the spears are important because it's part of that ritual of spearing. Ian Stead had seen it in earlier cemeteries. Really hasn't been discussed in huge amounts of detail. Probably Mel Giles has discussed them in one of her publications. And Mel actually came out on site this day when we were going to lift the sword. So he had evidence that he had been, once he had been placed in the grave, he had been speared. I would look at it in terms of a gun salute, equivalent of that, a modern day gun salute, that people around have thrown their spears in. We don't know for what reason, but it was part of that ritual of honouring. Not every male has that, but 17 to 25, in circular barrows, when you go back through steads, there is a pattern emerging in terms of these circular barrows. And he also had textile fragments adhering to the scabbard and his sword. And there's his photo of his burial. You can tell it's February, it's dusky time. The BBC had heard that we were excavating, and they asked if they could come out and film. They left their equipment on York Station. They arrived on site at about 1 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. They did their filming, went on till about 5 when everyone wanted to get off home. And it appeared on the front introduction of the Celts. And then they never said another word, apart from it was a burial in North Yorkshire. They couldn't even get the East Riding right, which was such a pity. The burial just wasn't mentioned, and we couldn't understand that. But there you go. That's television. They got what they wanted. So the opening of the Celts, if you ever go back and watch it, that's the burial that you will see, and they'll talk about a young man in North Yorkshire. So he had a well-preserved sword, and the blade, it was an iron blade, it had been bent when it went into the grave. That weapon was not intended to be used again. This is another thing, a pattern that's starting to emerge in terms of these burials. And it's comparable with Stead's 184 and 185 in the British Museum. And I put the site plan in because it actually is probably easier to depict the spears that are located down his spine. And you can see here this secondary burial that I was telling you about, these circular graves that have secondary burials with them. And this one is a female, quite an old female, 46 plus. And that's just to give you more detail of his sword and the spears clearly. Barrow 37, literally within 3 or 4 metres of Barrow 34, is a male aged 36 to 45. He's 90% complete. That's the skill of the excavator, because it is just literally the organic stain of the shield that you can see here, that he's been placed on his shield. And along his spine were nails and fittings. And he's also within a box. And then we come to Watery Grave, Barrow 32, another circular barrow. Doesn't look that impressive, but that was hitting the water table. It's another male aged 17 to 25. And his grave was deep at 0.6. And this skeleton tells a wonderful story. And this thanks to the specialist, Malin Holst, who really looked at the skeletal remains, and to be able to give the story of these people in these graves. This guy that went into this grave was put in prone, so his head down, and he had perimortem trauma. He had slash wounds, blunt force injuries, penetrating injuries. He had been pulverised. He had injuries to his left and right, so had huge trauma, but he had been accorded the same burial right, apart from being placed prone in the grave as the surrounding circular barrows. So it leads on to this warrior theme. Are these circular barrows specifically for males that have taken part in warfare or personal combat? But they're definitely singled out for a specific type of burial, and that's the site plan of him being under excavation, and you can see him prone. And interestingly, I'm just going to the perimortem blade injury on his skull, you can see he'd been slashed from behind, and it had penetrated and fractured the cranial vault. He also had a metal fragment that under X-ray and after conservation matched some of the fittings from the guy that had been buried on the shield. So there's a possibility that he had been placed in the grave and a shield had been placed on top of him. Pretty extreme that they really did want to finish him off, because within his mouth cavity was a fractured molar. So not only had they finished him off with the slash to the head and all the other wounds, they'd actually kicked him in the mouth or with a weapon and had fractured a tooth, and he was dead because he didn't have the reflux to be able to expel it. But you can see the fracture there. So pretty morbid. And then literally last week they decided that they wanted to strip a bit more area because they needed to get some electricity cables through, and we had a cart burial. Now, why am I changing it around from a chariot to a cart? Well, this is a really unpretentious vehicle. It's definitely had signs of use, but it had been really badly damaged in the medieval period, the truncation by ploughing. So much of it had been lost, apart from 2 horses, and they were laid flat, and you can see what's left of the skeleton here. And unfortunately, there wasn't enough skeletal material to be able to even sex. So I can't tell you if it's a male or a female, but it's not in a circular barrow, so I'm not going to go down that it's a warrior. It's definitely somebody that has been placed with the chariot, with the horses, and the shadow you can see coming through is the pole, and the 2 ponies are placed facing each other, and their legs have been wrapped around. So it really is the theatre of death in the Iron Age. This is a really significant person within that community that's been given this burial right. It's just to give you more indication, and you can see the pole just coming through. You get more detail from site plan again. So you can see here's the yoke, pole coming down, remains of skeleton here, horses placed with their feet wrapped around the pole, and then we had a nave hoop, an iron tyre, and once again the skill of the excavator, Mark getting his wish after 35 years to excavate the wheel and the organic stains of the spokes, 12 spokes, 88 centimetres in diameter, and you can see the iron rim here. One thing that I would say in terms of the chariots, the iron, once it comes out of the ground, is very, very fragile, and it literally, everything had to go to conservation that quickly. It's all ready to go to museum for display, but having looked at Iron Age finds in the East Riding, and they need a lot of care and attention. So what else did we find out? Well, David Reich at Harvard decided that he would like some of the DNA from the site, and he took 8 samples, of which it was published in Nature in 2022. He was so excited about the results from Burnby Lane that he's now taken all 130 Iron Age burials. So no doubt there's going to be another Nature paper in the near future. But as you can see, he's already, just with the 8 samples that he's got, he's already started to get second and third generation links. And that lady here with the lovely H brooch, she has links to barrows 46 and 48. Look at the barrows up here, these circular barrows. They have links to other circular barrows. So it's really starting to tell you that not only did people want to be buried there, second and third generations wanted to be buried nearby as well. So it's a really interesting story in terms of Iron Age, and it's probably some of the most significant work in terms of where the people have come from. So then I'm going on to Melton. So we've left Pocklington, thought that was going to be the highlight of careers, and literally within 2 months we went to a site. I called it Site X, but now everyone knows about Melton. Here it is down on the Humber, very flat, but with great views across the Humber. We thought we would get some burials. Trial trenching had been undertaken on the site, and a burial had been found, and it was pertained to have been within a ditch. It actually turned out that once again geophysics did not pick up the square barrows. These are deep features, but on these sands and gravels, it's not picking up the burials. And we had 48 burials, 12 square barrows, and the square barrows that we had were really significant. This is a poignant one. In this central grave here was a juvenile female, but surrounding, this is the first time that we've seen these deposits in the East Riding. They may be occurring elsewhere, but you see these pockets of animal bone. It's as though somebody has been coming back, or it was part of that ritual that they did feasting around that grave. Now, we haven't seen this. Melton was completely different to Burnby Lane in terms of it was more on the lines of what we would expect in terms of pig to be found with burials. We only had one piece of pig from Burnby Lane, but Melton, every burial had pig contained within it. And that's just a close-up to show you. So it obviously been in some kind of organic material, the way that it's compressed and compacted that bone. And that's how it was excavated. And to have them scattered around the barrow was quite a poignant thing to look at. And then we had, we called him Goat Man, because on site we thought these were all goats. Little did we know. No, 3 dogs and 3 goats. So that's not too bad, but we thought they were all goats. All the animals had been beheaded, then they'd been put back in the grave to make it look as though they'd been articulated when they went in. Fascinating. He also had his foot broken. It's a huge grave, so why that had happened, and you can see the angle that it's at. And within his barrow ditch, there were 9 neonates. C14 date, I said not much analysis has been undertaken, it's been taken to assessment. C14 date is pushing this burial into the 4th century BC. So it's much earlier than the Burnby Lane, around about 250 BC, that square barrow cemetery. The fact that they're on the Humber, are they marking out their area? Are these some of the earlier burials that we see in East Yorkshire for the Iron Age, for the square barrow tradition. Definitely watch this space in terms of this site. And then, totally to our amazement, a nave hoop came up. It was, I think, probably the blank slide, I'm sorry, was actually my overview of the cemetery, and I don't know why it hasn't come over. Sorry about that. But there was a very ephemeral barrow, but it had a very big grave. Looked so the ditches had been plied out. It had double ditches, which is very rare to find that. In fact, I can't think of another example in the East Riding of a double-ditched barrow. And there we can just see the ditches here. They don't survive here at all, so it's just in that northern area you can see the double ditches. We had another chariot. Now this I describe as a chariot because it has some beautiful really lateen decoration on some of the fittings. We had leather adhering to the turrets. We have one object that I keep on asking people, anyone any idea what this could be, but I'll get to that. And that was just one of the highlights, but once again, it was one of the last barrows to be excavated. And I think we were all pinching ourselves and going, it's not possible. Two in the space of a year. And then I just wanted to put that plan in again. You can see here he's got, on his hip he's got the pig skull and shoulder in that East Yorkshire tradition. And you can see the soil stains, the skeleton's placed on the superstructure, and the linchpins are incredible, decorated. I will show you. And he's a mature 46 plus, north-south alignment. And I had to put this one, the black and white one, in because it just reminded me so much of Tony Brewster's archive that I'd worked on, and just to see that we'd excavated this ourselves. You can see the pole is in two parts, the pole up here and then the pole here. He's placed on the pole. Down here, then you can see the axle, but the wheels have been dismantled and placed up above, and you can see the yoke here. The nave hubs actually had leather adhering to them, and it's probable that they were shock absorbers, acted as shock absorbers. So there was every indication that although it's dismantled, this chariot had been used. And once again, 12 spokes, 88 centimetres, just like the other one. So then, here you can see the yoke with the pole, the turrets that everyone's known about in terms of chariots. We have 4 turrets. We have an object here. And we also had 2 really tiny, intricately decorated fittings that also had leather. So they presumably were decorative rather than actually serving a purpose. However, this object here, under excavation, it was made of bronze for the exterior. The interior was iron. And adhering to it here were the reins, and you could definitely see the timber. It was a functional object. It's a mystery, and it's been speculated that it could be a later 5th turret, so the earliest version of a 5th turret. But nobody knows. So every talk I do, if anyone's ever seen anything like it, please let us know, because it will be very useful, and this site is still going to go forward for analysis and publication. And then on to the mile at Pocklington. So literally, in fact, we are going back to Melton it was going to be January, it's been pushed back to the end of Feb. Let's hope it's March, April, just with the weather conditions at the minute. And then we went to the Mile Pocklington. Mile Pocklington was well funded. No issues. Great archaeology, multi-phase landscape. Oh, no. We were doing the Anglian. That's what we were supposed to be doing. However, it turns out to be a multi-phase landscape. Once again, sorry, Anglian Pocklington, you've been pushed aside. This was the enclosure that we were supposed to be doing. You can see, well, we did do it. It's been excavated, and it will form its own volume with the Anglian burials. But it was the Iron Age finds on this site that sort of have taken over completely. You can see another development going on up here. It was a flood defence scheme, and they've had some really interesting results that have just coming out in terms of C14 dating. They had Neolithic burials in square barrows with Iron Age burials on top. And I had a phone call to discuss that. Now, looking back at the Anglian burial with the Iron Age pots, there seems to be a pattern sort of emerging. But these results, need to be integrated and looked at in the wider landscape before we make any judgments. But I did have a phone call to say, have you had anything strange like that? And then the 5 Iron Age skeletons, totally unexpected, not shown on the geophysics. We had 1 square barrow, very large square barrow, should have been an indicator, and 1 in a round barrow, and 2 plain graves. 3 adults, 1 juvenile and 1 fetus. So it's not an organised cemetery, and the spacing between these burials is about 60 metres, 20 metres. It's not the organised. It's only 1.5 kilometres away from Burnby Lane. It's going higher up onto the Wolds, but the burials themselves were very, very special. We were supposed to be excavating 3.3 hectares of this Anglian enclosure. The developer asked us to strip the whole of the site, which was 8 hectares, which was really, really fortunate, because within our first week, when we were the only ones on site, this circular square barrow turned up. Technically out of our area, but we had the site to ourselves, so we excavated it. And so pleased we did. It was one of these circular barrows with a deep central grave and 7 metres in diameter. And skeleton 303, I think probably we didn't name this one. I think we were doing it so rapidly. In this deep central grave. And immediately you were drawn to a grave that was adjacent to it. And he was, once again, something changed between doing Burnby Lane and excavating at the Mile. Literally 2 years space between. We went from 17 to 25 in osteology reports to 18 to 25. So it's not me going mad, I'm just putting in what the osteologist has now said the age of the skeleton is. He was 1.6 metres tall. He was, taller than the mean average height, but he was smaller than the guys that were buried at Burnby Lane. He'd suffered from chronic sinusitis, minor developmental anomalies of the lower spine, and he revealed dental disease, periods of stress, and malnutrition or disease during childhood. But he had been placed in the grave not only with a dismantled shield, and we know it's dismantled at the time of going into the grave because you can see here, but he was also speared as well. So it's going back to this connection of looking at these males of 17, 18 to 25 in the Iron Age population, and then being singled out for a different type of burial. And this is the church shield, and it's probably it's something very similar to what the Mile burial with the heart-shaped boss, I think probably it wasn't metal in its entirety. I think it was probably a wooden shield, and we're only left with the metal parts. The organic material has gone, disintegrated, and the 4 elements that survived included rivets and rivet holes, and looks quite spectacular. We're suggesting at the minute to Malton Museum that they put it on display next summer, which hopefully they will do. Everything will go to the East Riding Museums, but they're renovating everything at the minute. And it's just probably to get it out so as many people as possible can see the various elements and finds from the excavations, because they are spectacular. And then adjacent to skeleton 303 was skeleton 274. Don't ask why there were 3 of us on site, and we thought, God, wouldn't it be interesting if she was female? Well, she was female when it came out in the osteology report. She was 18 to 25 years old as well. She was orientated north side. She was in a very plain grave, and her hands were to the left of her face. But not only that, she had evidence of spina bifida, and on her ribs she has indentations of Ware that she's probably worn a corset. This would be really, really significant in Iron Age population, that she, if this turns out to be true. So that's another very poignant burial. Both the male and the female had signs of squatting. So I've put this slide in to show you, because we've lost that technique of being able to squat like that. But in the Iron Age, squatting was obviously part of everyday life. And it's only African tribes now that can still squat in a similar way. And then on to the large square barrow. On the edge, had been respected by the Anglian enclosure, just clipped a little bit here. You can just see this corner, the enclosure here, just clipped it. That had been respected within the landscape. And cleaning up the central grave area, 2 turrets came up, and then another one. It was in the cleaning. It wasn't from stratified deposits, but I think we can explain why they're in that position when you see what came up next. And I should actually put in, I should have put in a slide to show you, after the turrets were found, taking it down the deposits, a vertebrae sticking up in the ground, and everyone was looking, thinking, wow, what's going on here? So it was the remains of our 3rd chariot, and this was definitely the most spectacular, and I can truthfully say that we kept on looking at each other, and Mark and myself, and just going, is this really happening? So having waited 35 years, we've had 3 chariots in very quick succession, and even more significant, we had that lovely chariot with the 2 ponies wrapped around the pole, but these were upright, and there are no parallels for upright ponies in the UK. Yes, in Bulgaria there are, and definitely in China, but not in the UK. And it was largely complete, the chariot, and it really was quite spectacular. Once again, the BBC came and filmed. They only filmed part of it, which was quite sad when you think of the results that came after. And you can see the axle really clearly, the upright wheels, the chariot body, you can see that it tapered to the front. There was a male placed inside on a pole again. You can see the pole just coming through here, and then here, and the horses placed on the ground. The level of detail that went into that burial is just incredible. the story itself. People will ask, well, how did they get the ponies in there? It's over a metre deep, that grave. Well, they did, but we can't tell you if they were poleaxed because we don't have the heads. I think the reason why we don't have the heads is that the heads were probably poking out of the grave and over the years with ploughing, and that's why you've got the unstratified chariots. That's what's remained. As you go down and excavate, I think I'm correct in saying it was 8 weeks of excavation, but we had a gap in the middle because Mark went on holiday and he didn't want to miss anything. But it was 8 weeks in total excavation, and we got as much detail out of that burial. Dominic Powsland came along and did photogrammetry for us of the models. You can see on the internet are fantastic. We had numerous academics come out, and Peter Halkin said that he still can't forget me phoning and saying, we've got another one, Peter. We had Malcolm Lilly from the University of Hull, who started to look at different ways that we could get more academic funding. We had Derek Hamilton from Surak, who had worked on the previous excavation. Mel Giles has been involved in all the excavations. And it really is, just a fantastic project to have been involved in. And the chariot itself, I think probably you can see, we've got the outline so you can have a look at it. There's a lovely gentleman that specialises in chariots, and I've forgotten his name, Robert. Sorry, Robert. He was fascinated by it because it gives so much indication of how they were established, what level of detail in terms of the linchpins and everything, because the linchpins were intact, and the chariot body rested on the axle. But there was that missing link of how did the superstructure and the axle fit together. That we didn't have that evidence. We don't know. And the remains of the pole consisted of an intermittent soil stain that dipped down and was at least 1.3 metres long. So that gives you some indication. And there are the wheels. And obviously, because they're upright, the spokes, we didn't have the spokes at the top, but we had 6 spokes stains at the bottom, so we can tell you again that there's 12 spokes. This is the iron tyre, and here's the nave hoop here, which is beautifully decorated. And you can see the axle. And here's Ian Stead and John Dent, the leading authorities on the East Riding Iron Age cemeteries, coming out, and Ian was very, very excited in terms of the burial. But not only did we have a burial, we had this feasting fork here with a rib of pork still attached to it, that somebody had thrown into the grave as part of that respect for the man that was in there. He also had a huge amount of pig skulls surrounding him. You can see them during excavation. There's more pig around him than there was, if I just said, from one burial here at the Mile, than there wasn't the whole of Burnby Lane. So, pig is an expensive commodity in the Iron Age, and they were paying this person huge amounts of respect. He was obviously somebody very significant within the community to be afforded this burial right, and making it unique. The presence of that feasting fork, that's another find that hasn't been seen from an Iron Age context, burial context. So more evidence supporting, this respect and rites of passage, possibly linked to a warrior. When Alice Roberts looked at the skeleton, it was really interesting. She said that she could see, he had been using his fingers, possibly, for all his life, having veins running through them. That wasn't actually picked up in the osteology report, which I think is of interest. But it's just another side to this guy and who he was. When we lifted him, underneath there was this impression of a shield. It was block lifted, so that was the last time that we saw the shield for 18 months. But we sort of chuckled away to ourselves and, like most archaeologists, fantasised about what it was going to look like. And, of course, it had to be like the Wandsworth shield, which was in the British Museum, and found in the 19th century. That's the shield that we were going to have. And just to show you, this is part of the photogrammetry in terms of the burials, the two upright horses. You can see the detail, how they've placed the front legs on the ground. Just another one. Gives you really good indication of front legs on the ground. You will see the back legs that are lifted off the ground. So definitely that thing of the drama of the chariot lifting out, that's where we get that indication that the heads were probably out of the grave. But it's that whole theatre of an Iron Age burial, the quite spectacular burial, and the effort that they went into to place those ponies on blocks as it was excavated. You could see that they had been placed on blocks. They've skewed a bit, but I think that's, as it's collapsed the soils. Mark from the excavation implied, he said, the evidence is there to support that that burial was open to the elements, because the lower fill around the wheels was that fine sands and gravels that was completely different to the rest of the fills. So he argues that that was open to the elements for a certain amount of time. So who was he? Well, he was 46 plus, definitely a lot older than that, but that's where it stops in terms of osteology reports. He was lying on the right, he was orientated north-south, he had both hands close to his face, and he was 1.74, and he'd lost most of his teeth. We called him Gummy. And during his life, going back to the warrior theme, he had sustained a number of traumatic lesions, including a fracture of the lumbar vertebrae. And he showed evidence of physical activity, including squatting, bending and lifting, trauma to the left thigh and a broken healing rib, and osteoporosis. And I should go on and say, and one of the horses did as well. They were mature animals, they were draft animals, they were about 13 hands, and I didn't say that about the Burnby Lane ones. They were a similar size, they were mature, but I can't tell you how they got them in or how they died. So, sorry about that. And the isotope analysis, this is where I just think we do the excavation and then everybody else puts the sort of fabric on it and it brings it to life. And the isotope analysis shows his movement. Oxygen isotopes are linked to his drinking water. The strontium is connected to the geology of the food he was eating or raised, and the sulphur is the movement of individuals. And this guy had moved around. His sulphur was the food. It was grown and raised on the chalk. His rib bone was considerably different, though, and he'd lived in a different place in his childhood, and possibly in his final years he'd come back. Problem that Derek says that this is going to change on the investigations, research from these cemeteries. There was no baseline for Pocklington, but now we have the baseline with the 130 burials that hopefully much more work will be undertaken on it. And he's consistent with having been living and born around Pocklington, but there is a caveat that they have all sort of locked into. He could be from further afield, but he could also be from the Paris Basin. So this whole big thing in terms of migration, why is East Yorkshire different? It still is not definite, but David Reich at Harvard thinks there's something very special about the population that he wants. He's undertaking the work. So we can't say conclusively that he is, because there isn't the data from the Paris Basin, but it would be really interesting now to look at, is that migration, for whatever reason? We know people from the Paris Basin went into Italy, into the Alps. Did they also come to East Yorkshire? So that big overriding question of migration is still an open door. There is no definitive answer, but there is something definitely different about these people from the cemeteries that have been investigated. So watch this space on that one, I would say. And here we go with the photogrammetry model, and I said that you can see horses not placed on the ground like this one, that's in the air. And the empty grave, very sad and very poignant. And then back to the conservation. So all the conservation and all the finds are now ready to go on display. You can see Mags Felder here lifting the upright wheel, and this is one of the spearheads from burial back to the Burnby Lane. It's burial here. And that's one of the spearheads that went into the grave. And you can see sockets here. And the wood adhering inside is ash, which is also the timber that's used for the wheels as well. And then this is from 303 at the mile. He actually had bone and iron spears, and those spears would have glistened. And you can see that it's in good condition, but you can also see the marks, the tool marks for whittling it to make that arrow, and once again perforations. And this is one of the unstratified territs. Great example, parallels exactly with the King's Barrow at Arras that was 200 years ago. One of the ones that had horses, but when you actually read the text, it's not very clear in terms of horses and what the evidence was. But at least now we have two chariots with horses, and the guy that was buried in the upright chariot had this beautiful brooch with that lovely glass bead, suggestive, I think, of a dragonfly, that zoomorphic, once again going back to that. And then I put this in because I can see horses' hooves, I can definitely see horses' heads, I can definitely see mistletoe with the coral, and then the dragonfly. So just to give you the imagery that I have in my head, and my colleagues do. And this is the feasting fork. You can see here the iron bar with the elements, and this is the rib that was adhering to it. Parallels, possibly from Spain, late Bronze Age, early Iron Age. Ooh, are we looking at evidence of a pattern of something that is flowing from the continent into the East Riding? And this is one of the beautiful nave hubs here, and you can see the oxidised material on the back. And then I've put the linchpins in, and Peter and myself were talking earlier about linchpins. Now, our linchpins, you can see here, have an enamel knob. When they came out of the ground, we had no idea. Off they went, and it's only at conservation. our linchpins from Melton and our linchpins from the mile are made by the same person. That's another side to what this information can tell you about people and who are making these objects in the Iron Age. And then, I'm really sorry, that I should have more spectacular, but I got invited to go to York Archaeological Trust, and I was going about something else, and they said, oh, would you like to come in and see something? And they are my photos as I took. So, yeah, I think we did really well guessing what we had. And this is another thing that we've been discussing. Because Iron Age finds from cemeteries are classified as treasure, and the owner of the land was the developer, there were 6 months of very delicate persuasion that they wouldn't make a claim. But what they did ask was that it could be valued. And it was valued, and the lady came up and valued it, and it's a 6-figure sum. And the lady said, I can't give you any more than that, because objects like this don't come on the market very often, but when they do, the sky's the limit. So obviously that report went back to the developer and the chairman, and they said that they would gift it. But it had taken quite a few months of persuasion to get them to gift it, and I'm really, really pleased. All the developers have gifted all the objects, and thank you is what I say to them on that, because it is quite spectacular and it is breathtaking. And Malta Museum in North Yorkshire is a really small museum, and they had it on loan for a month, and they had over 1,000 visitors. Now, for them, that was huge. So just the appeal of people to see these wonderful objects is immense. So we've got to get them out more and more into the wider public domain so they can see them, because it is spectacular. It's quite breathtaking. Now, Mel, I thought, oh, wow, that's amazing. It's got a slash mark in it. I thought, oh, it's been used. She thinks it's probably something to do with the imagery on the shield, and it's putting a destruction on it. I'll leave that to her. She's a specialist. And this is just the wonderful drawings, just to show you how your eye's captured by it and the symmetry of it. You look and you're drawn clockwise round it from the smaller tab to the larger tabs. And it's just so beautifully decorated. And it's a classic rite, the fact that he was placed on that classic rite of inversion that we're seeing through the Iron Age. And it's Mel's thoughts on it. It's to fox the dead and consign the object to the netherworld. So I'm using her words there. And then just to show you, you can see here the decayed wood traces. And the huge amount of publicity. We were awarded, but voted by the public, Rescue Archaeology Project of the Year. We've been on Digging for Britain twice, including the Hour special. And, the media is always interested. We've even had MPs actually come and have a look and want to take photographs. So, we can push archaeology more and more their way, so they don't leave us out of everything. And then it's been published in the Archaeological of Eastern Yorkshire, edited by Peter Alcan. And then about a year ago, Chariots, Swords and Spears came out. And that's our update at the moment. So we've got it all 2 sites published within 4 years of excavation, which is quite remarkable. Melton, sorry, you're going to have to watch this space on that one, but by hook or by crook it will be. And just thanks to all the fantastic archaeologists that I've worked with who've made it so enjoyable, and it has been a really successful outcome in terms of commercial archaeology, developers and academia working together to get the results out. So, thank you.